The fallout from the phone hacking scandal in Britain is being felt in Australia. After days of revelations of unethical practices in the UK, local politicians are calling for a media inquiry to make sure the same techniques aren't used here. There's no evidence that the Australian arm of the Murdoch empire, News Limited, has engaged in any wrongdoing. But 7:30 can reveal there's widespread belief in the senior ranks of the Gillard government that News Limited is using some of its papers to try to force an early election. The government's suspicion of the company runs so deep that it's delayed awarding a multi-million-dollar broadcasting contract out of fears it might go to a company partially owned by News Limited. Political editor Chris Uhlmann has been investigating.
Clearly, practices of certain individuals did not live up to the standards and quality of journalism that we believe in and that I believe in.
The once unassailable empire of News International is on its knees in Britain. The man who fashioned it and its fearsome reputation is under siege.
So you turn around.
Once cowed politicians are finding their voice.
What has happened at this company is disgraceful. It's got to be addressed at every level, and they should stop thinking about mergers when they've got to sort out the mess they've created.
And its power is unwinding. News has withdrawn its bid for full ownership of broadcaster B Sky B.
This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to acquire 100% of a business which has extraordinarily good prospects.
The different arms of News make it the largest and most powerful media organisation in the English-speaking world.
I'm not talking about that issue at all today, sorry.
OK, no worries, Mr Chairman.
And around the world, questions are being asked.
There's been continuing revelations about the controversy surrounding the Murdochs and News Corp.
Now in the best traditions of Fleet Street, we're going to the pub.
The fall of News International is extraordinary, but so is its rise, and it started here. Rupert Murdoch built a modest inheritance into a corporation that rose to dominate the landscape.
Well, front perhaps, or on page 3.
Yes.
Now, by the time people pull it out and turn it around, they've got to do all those things before they realise it's not an ad.
And News has never been afraid to use its power. The Australian backed Labor in 1972.
The man who is going to be the first Labor Prime Minister of Australia for 23 years, Gough Whitlam.
And then the Australian turned against the Whitlam government in 1975.
And the instructions relayed by the editor were, Rupert wants us to go balls and all for Whitlam, and none of this essay stuff that we were doing then.
On the 9th of December 1975, journalists on The Australian went on strike and issued a statement.
Saying we cannot be loyal to a propaganda sheet. It was the first time in Australian history that journalists had gone on strike for such a reason.
Yeah, well, you started to go there, Minister.
No, you
where
were asked,
you go, I follow.
Asked.
36 years on, another Labor government believes it's being targeted.
Can I tell you, there's a piece that ran in the Oz on the 13th...
You're not believing anything you read in the Australian.
I'm coming here for corroboration. This is where we come...
Really, that's a disturbing position for the Greens to take.
I didn't say I believed it. I came here to seek independent corroboration of whether it's true or not.
Well, I mean, you should start from the basis the Australian don't bother reporting news anymore. They're engaged in regime change.
Senator Conroy's view is widespread in Cabinet. 7:30 has spoken to a number of senior ministers who are convinced that News Limited is determined to force an election. Senior ministers say the Australian's editor-in-chief, Chris Mitchell, has a long-running campaign against it, and that attitude has spread to the Daily Telegraph under its new editor, Paul Whittaker. As one minister said, having the Australian against you is disturbing. Having the Daily Telegraph against you, now that's dangerous. It might be a coincidence, but since Paul Whittaker became editor in late April, the Telegraph's front page has routinely hammered the government, ridiculed the Treasurer and Communications Minister, and found barely anything good in the budget. And that's not a view that's just confined to government.
Rob Oakeshott, how do you believe that News Limited acts in Australian politics?
Look, I really didn't think about it before this Parliament, but probably at the front end of now some of the policy processes have been put under a lot of scrutiny by them, and some of it has been shamelessly unfair or in many cases, in my view, malicious. But in the end, that's their definition of scrutiny at times, and I think it really raises the broader question of media in Australia generally, whether the market is big enough to have a couple of players dominating the marketplace, and whether in Australia today in public policy there is a need for a media inquiry.
The Greens have been at war with News Limited for a while.
I'm just wondering why the hate media, it's got a negative front page from top to bottom today, can't be more responsible and constructive. Let me finish. I'm just asking you why you can't be more constructive.
And after the revelations in Britain, the Greens are also calling for a media inquiry that goes beyond just looking at News Limited.
I think it's prudent, wise and proper that we look to have such a review here in Australia.
The Prime Minister is listening.
And I will be happy to sit down with parliamentarians and discuss that review that people are obviously contemplating.
The government's beef with News Limited bubbled to the surface on the 24th of May, when Senator Conroy began spiking the Australian stories by putting out press releases with its journalists' questions before they were published. The Defence Minister weighed in, revealing details of a story that the Australian had exclusively on the delay of the $8 billion air warfare destroyer project.
The advice of the Alliance is that if no action is taken to relieve the pressure on the Melbourne shipyard, the first ship would be 2 years late.
The government's distaste for News Limited is reflected in a recent decision. The $223 million Australia Network contract is up for grabs. It's currently run by the ABC, and the budget for it comes out of the coffers of the Department of Foreign Affairs. The tender for the contract came out in December, and the ABC and Sky both bid for it. Sky is part owned by News Limited, and John Hartigan is chairman of both. The bids were sent to an evaluation board made up of senior bureaucrats. The Foreign Minister's office confirmed in April that the final decision maker would be the Secretary of his department, Dennis Richardson, and that Cabinet would not have a role. But in early June, that wasn't entirely clear.
Mr Richardson, can you explain to me why you think there is a problem in advising who actually within government is the final decision maker for this contract?
I can only say that I would need to take that on advice.
Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd did run this process by the Prime Minister's office, but other ministers were appalled by it and demanded that Cabinet get the final say. That's led to a very odd outcome. The tender is still being run by the Department of Foreign Affairs, but it's being overseen by the Communications Minister, Stephen Conroy. And the deadline for a decision has been extended by 6 months. No one will say what the tender board recommended. Ministers only say no decision was made. So there's reason to suspect that Sky came out on top, and that this could all end up in court. It raises lots of questions about the process, and about how deep the government's disdain for News Limited runs, and finally about how much the rest of Cabinet trusts the Foreign Minister.
Why aren't you the final approver?
Well, I'll draw your attention to what Senator Conroy said today in the Senate, and it's a remark with which I completely concur, and that is the decision maker, in effect, is the Cabinet itself. The approver is consistent with other contractual arrangements entered into by the government in a whole range of different areas.
7:30 asked both the editors of The Australian and The Daily Telegraph for interviews. They're adamant they're just doing their job, holding the government to account, and they can point to many examples of when they went just as hard on the Howard government. Both Chris Mitchell and Paul Whittaker declined interviews, partly, perhaps, because shortly all these questions will be addressed by their boss. And they'd know better than anyone, a reality all too often forgotten by most. No one has to answer a journalist's questions.
Chris Ullman reports.